Hello, everyone, and welcome to Neurocracy. Today, I'm honored to welcome Dr. Kent Berridge, a James Olds Distinguished University Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience at the University of Michigan. His pioneering work on the neural mechanisms of affect, emotion, and motivation, particularly in the distinction between liking and wanting, has been transformative in understanding how the brain processes reward and emotion, and addiction. Thank you for joining me today.
It's nice to be with you, Sanjay.
So, my first question is, what first drew you into studying effective neuroscience?
Well, I've always been interested in how brains could have evolved to mediate particular psychological processes. How minds come out of brains and how brains are evolved by evolution pressures, both in us and in other animals. And when I went to graduate school to specialize, I was very interested in motivation and emotion. It seemed there was a lot of focus in neuroscience and psychology on learning and cognition and perception, but not quite as much on motivation and emotion. And I wanted to understand that better. So that's how I got into it.
Yeah. Okay. So your work shows that liking and wanting are distinct processes in the brain. And in today's world of endless digital stimulus like Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook, how might this separation explain why people keep scrolling or checking their notifications, even when it seems repetitive?
Well, it can. It can because a lot of the internet and social media have features that tap into our incentive salient system of wanting, little nuggets of information, brief bits that catch our attention and invite us to go on. And it can detach from pleasure. But I have to say, when I got into the field, I never really expected that liking and wanting would be separated. That was a surprise to me. And it actually came out of some almost failed experiments that were initially disappointing.
Could you explain a little bit more about how you guys discovered that liking and wanting are distinct processes?
Sure. Um, when I entered the field decades ago, most of us in neuroscience thought that dopamine, mesolimbic dopamine, was the
Yeah.
pleasure neurotransmitter, and it's still kind of famous as a reward neurotransmitter.
Right.
There was a number of neuroscientists doing studies on that, but there was one champion above all who really led that hypothesis. That was Roy Wise in Canada. And he would show that if he gave dopamine blocking drugs to animals, drugs that would block the dopamine receptors, so it's suppressing their dopamine. What happens is they would gradually abandon rewards. They would abandon food rewards and stop working for them and stop eating them. They would stop working for drug rewards like cocaine or amphetamine. They would stop working for sex rewards or social rewards or electrical brain stimulation, so-called pleasure electrode rewards. And it seemed as though they just didn't want those rewards anymore. And he inferred they didn't like them anymore. And it made sense. And he had some clever experiments to do it.
Yeah.
I My first dopamine experiment was actually collaboration with Roy Wise, and my goal was to add one more little piece of evidence on top of his enormous pile of evidence that dopamine was pleasure liking. But we were looking at it a little bit differently than previous studies had been doing. My approach sort of uses natural behavior. It's called a neuroethological approach, where we have natural expressions. And if you have newborn human babies, sometimes their parents will give them little tastes of the food that the adults eat to see if the babies like it. If the baby kind of smiles and licks its lips, or does the baby gape and shake its head and scrunch up its face. These are kind of pleasure, displeasure reactions to the taste. Monkeys and apes have similar facial expressions, and even rats, which are omnivores like us, they like sweet and fatty and salty foods. They don't like bitter foods. They have some of those expressions, like lip licking or gapes to bitterness, lip licking to sugar and gapes to bitterness. So we thought if we gave dopamine blocking drugs, that would suppress the liking reactions, the facial expressions to sugar. And we did that, Roy Wise and I, as a collaboration, and it didn't change their facial expressions at all, to our disappointment.
Okay.
And I thought, well, maybe we just did the experiment wrong. So I repeated it with some other psychopharmacologists and got the same result. And then finally, with my colleague Terry Robinson here at Michigan, we said, well, maybe the drugs just aren't strong enough. Why don't we take away the dopamine system? And it's possible to do that in animals. It happens in people with Parkinson's disease, the dopamine system die, but it
Yeah.
can happen in laboratory animals by microinjecting a neurotoxin into the brain that only kills neurons that have dopamine,
Right.
and all the other neurons remain. And so we did that. We eliminated 99% of the brain's dopamine, and we found still the rats had normal liking for sugar and disliking for bitter, and they could learn new likes and dislikes, but they never wanted to eat anything. They never wanted to drink anything. We kept them alive as you and I would be in a hospital intensive care ward with artificial nutrition and hydrations. Um, that was the beginning of the notion that, well, maybe dopamine is not so much about the liking of rewards as it is about the wanting. I didn't really believe it though until we started to turn on the dopamine system with microinjections of amphetamine in the nucleus accumbens that causes dopamine to be
Yeah.
spilled into the nucleus accumbens, activating the dopamine, or electrodes that stimulate the dopamine neurons and make them fire and release their dopamine. And as we did that, we found that that always increased the wanting for rewards, like the rats would eat 8 times more than they normally would,
Wow.
but it didn't increase their liking. And if anything, it made them dislike the taste a little bit while they were eating more.
Wow.
That's when I began to believe that dopamine was really more about wanting than it was about liking.
Wow. Very interesting story.
Mhm.
So, my next question is about appetite regulation, which is central to global health and especially relevant with rising obesity rates. And from what you've learned about how appetite is controlled in the brain, do you have any idea of interventions that could be effective in helping people resist unhealthy food environments?
Well, the liking and wanting systems very, very closely intermingled with hunger and satiety systems. You know,
Okay.
it used to be that textbooks would separate that there'd be one chapter on brain reward and motivation, and there'd be a different chapter on hunger and satiety.
Yeah.
But in the last 20 years, it's been clear that they really are absolutely interconnected. And in fact, you know, one of the newest kinds of drugs that are helping people lose weight, the GLP-1 agonists,
Yeah.
drugs like Ozempic and Mounjaro, GLP-1 and similar drugs that mimic natural satiety peptides. GLP-1 is a natural satiety peptide, but the agonists are artificial drugs that plug into the receptors for that. And it turns out that those drugs, they can act not only in the hindbrain and hypothalamus where hunger and satiety circuits are, but they're also acting in the dopamine neuron ventral tegmentum where the dopamine neurons live
Yeah.
and their projections. And the drugs are also acting in the nucleus accumbens. And it turns out that they are really reducing the sort of wanting for food, sort of, and you can measure this in human fMRI studies where people's limbic systems light up, the brain reward system lights up to the images of food, especially when you're hungry, if they're palatable, tempting images. But when you take these GLP-1 agonists, it kind of suppresses that. It doesn't suppress the liking for food. It just suppresses this mesolimbic wanting, this incentive salience for food. And that's one of the ways in which these drugs are helping people lose weight. Those same drugs are now being tried out in studies of addiction, like alcoholism and such. And the initial results are kind of promising. So it does look like this wanting system is relevant to appetite for foods, and it's relevant also to appetite for other things.
Yeah. So another relevant issue in the world is mental health, and many people today struggle with anxiety and depression, and they often describe a loss of motivation or blunted pleasure. So I wanted to ask, can this idea of liking and wanting shed light on what's happening in these disorders?
Well, there's evidence that it does. This evidence doesn't come from my lab or
Okay.
my colleagues, but from other people who are studying these syndromes. Yeah, as you say, depression, schizophrenia, and
Yeah.
Parkinson's disease patients, when they're not taking their medication, all of these in psychiatry textbooks have been called to have anhedonia, the lack of pleasure in life,
Right.
because the patients simply don't find anything really rewarding or motivating to work for. But when people have looked more closely in the last 10 years, especially for anhedonia and schizophrenia and Parkinson's disease, it turns out that a lot of that is not true anhedonia at all, but what's now being called avolition, a loss of motivation, a loss of wanting. Sometimes it's called anticipatory anhedonia as opposed to consumatory anhedonia or true anhedonia. It seems to be a loss of wanting selectively, and the liking is perfectly normal. For depression, major depression, it's a little more complicated, and it looks like some patients might also have this avolition but normal pleasure, but other patients with depression have true anhedonia, and so that picture is still more complicated and still kind of emerging.
Okay. So another thing I wanted to ask about is fear and desire, which are often intertwined, especially when you think about thrill seekers in extreme sports or traders that are balancing risk and reward in split-second decisions. So has your research revealed anything about how that brain handles tension and how it can kind of explain modern risk-taking behavior?
Well, I wouldn't say we have an explanation for risk taking per se, but what I would say is our work has shown that there's some sort of sharing of the brain mechanisms for desire and fear in things
Okay.
like the nucleus accumbens. I mean, the nucleus accumbens is part of the reward system, so it's
Right.
famous for desire and pleasure. But we can also generate, in laboratory experiments with rats, we can generate fear through the nucleus accumbens. That
Wow.
it's sort of an active kind of fear. The desire, the wanting system of the dopamine system, it's the wanting that's temptations, the sight of food when you're hungry, things that catch your eye, consumer items that you want. That's that kind of wanting. The kind of fear that dopamine systems engage in is sort of an active coping kind of fear. It's not so much the passive withdrawal and shrinking away, but sort of if something threatening and you're doing something to cope with that kind of thing. That system can flip back and forth between desire and fear in some situations. And it seems possible that people who are in roller coasters or in other things that are generating kind of fear, but also an exhilaration, that kind of circuitry is flipping and sort of generating both, with a positive tone for those who enjoy it, dominating through that kind of sharing of circuitry.
Okay. So my next question is a little more relevant to like me and like college and high school students, but I wanted to mention that learning is increasingly being shaped by gamification, like turning these somewhat boringly seeming tasks into reward-based challenges. So from your perspective on how rewards are learned and how motivation circuits function, what makes gamification effective, and are there potential places that it could backfire?
Well, I think what makes gamification effective is just what you say. It sort of boils it down into little bits and kind of gives you a reward or a thrill, some
Yeah.
kind of a positive outcome if you do it. Um, there's nothing wrong with that. The only thing is that
Okay.
it's very limited to, just particular purposes. And as you go on, as you know already in high school and as you go on in college, there are some things you can learn in little bits, and there are other things that kind of require your sustained, focused attention and
Yeah.
delving through. And gamification isn't really the solution to that. So I'd say the risk perhaps is that it kind of focuses all of our attention on things that can be gamified and
Okay. I see.
would pull us away from perhaps more deserving topics that
Right.
require a sustained effort.
Yeah. So, continuing this topic of like technology, we live in an era where technology can change behavior, especially with fitness apps like AI-driven ads and AI like algorithms determining like the content that shows up on your social media. So, are there any ethical concerns that arise when companies like Instagram design systems that inherently engage your brain's reward circuits, but may reduce your productivity, for instance?
Well, I think, both technology and even before technology, advertising, consumer, things they are designed to tap into your wanting system to trigger temptations and desire and pull you in. That's the world we live in and that we have lived in now for quite a while. That's what civilization has produced. And in a way, we're very
Yeah.
lucky to live in that world because there's all these good and rewarding, enjoyable things to potentially do. Are there ethics involved? Should advertisers pull back from not being so tempting? Should social media companies tame it down? Well, I think the the burden of the responsibility is mostly on the consumer, and most people can kind of self-regulate and consume within bounds. There are some who can't, and that's a problem, and that needs dealing with. But I'm not sure that the solution would be to simply ban those things for everyone.
Okay. I'm just curious. So, did you have any like strong opinions on the like I guess short-term banning of TikTok like a couple months ago, or based on your research, or
I don't have a strong opinion. No, I
okay,
think, if that were banned, it might have something more to do with the control, who controls it and who
okay,
has access to information rather
right,
than the tidbits themselves.
yeah,
Yeah.
okay. So, looking ahead in the next like decade or so, which area of effective or which areas of effective neuroscience do you think are going to become the most relevant in modern society?
Well, we would love to understand things like addictions, drug addiction as the classic, which is
Right.
right, still a problem, and behavioral addictions, including even social media addictions, which
Yeah.
seem to have, there's some evidence to say they're similar in mechanisms to the drug addictions for some individuals. Um, that's a problem, and we would love to have better solutions to that problem.
Yeah.
GLP-1 agonists might help a bit, but
Right.
again, they're not going to be a magic bullet for everyone.
Yeah. So especially with the world becoming more digitalized, do you think there's ever going to become like interventions or systemic changes that almost like address like this kind of digital like reward like trap almost in a way? Or do you think or what do you think like the future looks like in that kind of
It's
field?
possible there would be sort of therapeutic apps that might protect you, that might sort of
Right.
turn off your screen after a few
Right.
minutes.
Yeah.
You could employ those sorts of things if you wanted, but there'll always be I think it'll always require a little voluntary decision to do that on the part of the user as opposed to simply being imposed usually.
Yeah. All right. So on that note, thank you, Dr. Berridge, for taking the time, share your insights, and talk with me on this podcast. And it was a pleasure having you on.
Well, it was nice to talk with you, Sanjay, and good luck in the future and in all your projects.
Thank you.
Okay, bye bye.
Bye.
So you've got it.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I